Hey guys, Mr. Klein here, and we are on our last lesson of the chapter on Alexander the Great, where the Greek civilization becomes a worldwide phenomenon, at least in a known world, and establishes its place in history as one of the great empires, even though it was founded by a guy who actually wasn't Greek. So let's go ahead and let's get going with this. Now, if you remember, last lesson we were talking about the Peloponnesian War, and the Peloponnesian War ended with Sparta taking over the bulk of Athenian and Delian League city-states. And the infighting that resulted from this when they revolted against Sparta left Greece weak. And what had happened was by 360 BC, Philip II of Macedonia, he was a king of Macedonia, which I'll talk about in a second to set the place. Or Philip of Macedon is another way to look at it. It's a bust of him. Invaded Athens and won easily, making the rest of Greece surrender. And this was a really traumatic and terrible event in Greek history because here's the thing. The Macedonians lived in this general area up here. So, Athens is here, Sparta's here, the Greeks, and the Macedonians lived up here. They were considered barbarians or non-civilized people because Macedonians said that boys could not sit at the table with men until they had killed a wild boar by either on horseback or with a spear or sword, and they didn't quite speak real Greek, so they were kind of considered backwoods people, almost rednecks, if you will. And so there was no way that these Macedonians could totally take on the mighty Greeks who defeated the Persians and things like that. So Philip of Macedonia's conquest of Greece was amazing. And he owed his success not to the fact that he was a redneck and Greek redneck and was able to shoot a gun better, if you will, even though guns weren't invented then, but rather Philip had a very unique army, which we'll talk about in the next little section. He included changes in military tactics, going from infantry or just foot soldiers to combined infantry with cavalry, and then especially the introduction of the phalanx, which included soldiers carrying 16-foot long spears. And this is the Greek phalanx right here. So you would have soldiers holding these huge long spears that they would march with their shields protecting them, and they would stab into the infantry, making it difficult to attack. And when you include it with traditional infantry and cavalry, it makes it really tough to beat. And this really changed things. Philip planned to take on, with the Greek peoples under his progress and army, take on the Persian Empire themselves, who did not like the Macedonians either, but he was murdered. And his son, some guy named Alexander, took the throne. Yes, this guy, Alexander the Great, one of the major characters in world history, one of the most famous guys in Western civilization, and we think of as a Greek person, actually wasn't really Greek. He was raised on Greek ideas. In fact, as a student, he learned from a teacher named Aristotle, which was one of the philosophers I talked about in the last lesson. Aristotle was famous for coming up with lots of theories and stuff about the world that we use for over 1,000 years. And when he took the throne, Alexander didn't realize it, but he was going to go on a 15-year campaign of constant war and conquer most of the known world. But the very first thing he did was he took care of problems at home. After Athens and Sparta, probably the next great city was Thebes, and they rebelled against the Macedonians. And Alexander sent his army in, defeated them, and once he was done, he wanted to set an example. He enslaved almost the entire population and took their army in and told any other Greek city-state that they did anything similar, they would suffer a similar fate. Once that was done, obviously the Greeks rallied behind him. His Macedonian army swept through Greece, went into Turkey, pushed south, took out Egypt, and then pushed into Persia itself. So what happened was the Athenians, once these all guys fell into line with Alexander, he swept here into Turkey. In Syria, there was a major battle where he defeated the Persian army. He pushed south took Egypt, and then headed back up, swung through Babylon, pushed through, and pushed for Persepolis. All the time, the Persian emperor Darius III was running from him, with him chasing. He ends up conquering the Persian capital. By then, Darius was killed, and a servant in Darius's house named himself Emperor of the Persians and runs off. But Alexander found Darius's body and gives him a royal funeral. And according to legend, Alexander said that he found Darius before he died, and Darius bequeathed him the entire Persian Empire. And as a result, Alexander thought he would give himself a great name, Alexander the Great. And from there, he pursued what was left of the Persian army and had a great idea about actually attacking and conquering the entire known world, an idea that we'll see later on with the Mongols at the end of this year. He pushed eastward from Persia and actually only turned back in India, where you found people from Greece actually fighting on the Hypsasis River against war elephants. And only then, when at the Ganges River, did Alexander's soldiers finally mutiny and say no more, because they didn't want to cross a huge river with an entire invading army sitting on the other side of it. So if we look at this, Alexander, once again, and I'll use the pen, he started here in this area. Let me switch to red. He started here, and he pushed through, chasing the Persian army. At Issus was the major battle where he broke the back of Darius III and set Darius running. And from there, he pushed through into Egypt, where he was named Master of the Universe. He went through and continued to break and pass through the bulk of the Persian army. And here at Persepolis was where where they were finally defeated. And from there, he pushed on. He pushed on out here, went through Parthia and areas like that, went up into modern Afghanistan, pushed down. This was where his army finally turned back, and then he took a long, winding path through all the way back, and where he passed away at Babylon, which we'll talk about in a second. So in 14 years, he actually went from here in Greece all the way to here in India and conquered everything in between, pretty much undefeated. Alexander died of an illness, or could have been poison, probably illness, only at the age of 33, because he felt like there was nowhere else to conquer. He was heartbroken. His close friend had passed away, and also probably a life of hard fighting and stuff did him in. But his empire stretched from the Adriatic Sea in Europe all the way to India in the east. And had Alexander wanted, he probably could have pushed across the Ganges River and actually plunged into India, if his army, which at this time had included people from all over this empire, including the bulk of the Persian army, which defected to him, in their path. And at their largest, Alexander's army was nearly 125,000 soldiers. And it was unique in the ancient world in that it had kind of what we would consider a modern army. In the modern army, you have infantrymen, which are foot soldiers. You have cavalry in terms of tanks, and then you have artillery in terms of big guns. And Alexander had something similar. He had the phalanx. He had his foot soldiers. He had archers. He had cavalrymen, which was a central part of his army, as well as artillery in terms of siege engines, things like that, to attack cities. So this was a huge modern army that just swept everything before it. Now, that's the military history. Now let's talk a little bit about the social history of Alexander. Like I said, Alexander was in Greek. He was Macedonian. Remember, he's kind of like the redneck of Greek civilization. They thought of them as barbarians. But because he was educated by Aristotle, he greatly admired Greek culture, and he spread Greek influence and Greek culture everywhere he conquered. He thought the Greeks were the greatest things ever, and he introduced Greek culture to everyone he went after. Everywhere he conquered, he would found a city, and he founded over 30 cities based on Greek ideas, and he named them all Alexandria. Many of them still survive to this day. No, Alexandria, Louisiana, and Alexandria, Virginia were not founded by Alexander the Great. They were named after them. But, for example, Alexandria in Egypt, one of Egypt's largest cities, is still here and is considered to be one of the great cities in the Middle East and in the world. It was a great, especially during the ancient world, it was considered to be the home of Western knowledge and stuff like that, right outside of Athens and Rome. And so he founded all of these Alexandrias, and he spread Greek culture and Greek thinking and Greek ideas around the world, but he didn't force people to do so. In fact, he allowed conquered people to keep their own culture just like the Persians did. Alexander also considered himself a Persian as a successor to the Persian Empire, and so he spent most of his later campaign just trying to keep the Persian Empire together under his Greek rule. But this mix of local and Greek culture that after Alexander the Great died, later on in history, in the 1900s, they gave a name to this mixture, and we call it Hellenistic culture, after the Greek word for Greece itself, which is Hellas. And so the Hellenistic culture is kind of like the mix of Greek and local cultures within that. And like I said, Alexander the Great died young, and 33. He had no heir or no king to succeed him, and so his generals started fighting over the land. So Alexander's empire didn't last very long. It eventually fell apart, and there were three major kingdoms, one of which was in Macedonia itself, another one was in Syria, and finally, the one was in Egypt. And so let's look at this map, and the names are in German. This is the Mediterranean, this is the Black Sea, Caspian Sea, Aral Sea, Indian Ocean. So you had Macedonia right here. This was the Cassandras kingdom. This was the Lysimachus, led by the general Lysimachus. It was Asia Minor, if you will, of Turkey. The bulk of this was the Seleucid Empire kingdom, led by the general Seleucus, which over here, not very long, only 2 years after Alexander the Great had passed away, Chandragupta Maurya founded the Mauryan Empire over here. So when we talked about that in Indian history, this is right when the Gupta Empire was founded. And finally, you had the Ptolemaic Empire right here, based in Egypt and its capital in Alexandria. And the greatest center of Hellenistic culture was in Egypt because it survived the longest. Each of these fell apart sooner or later. They were conquered. The Seleucids ended up kind of reverting back to Persian culture. Over here was related to Greek. Macedonia eventually just rolled back into being how it was before. But the idea of Hellenistic culture stayed in Alexandria, Egypt. And so it held on for about 300 years until our next unit, when we talk about the Romans, when the Roman Republic swept in. In the end, these cities in Alexandria and Greek culture, as we think of, fell between 60 and 30 BC. Even though it fell, Greek civilization is felt even to this day. Our language, our ways of thinking, ideas in science and stuff, all owe to Hellenistic ideas. And it wouldn't have been possible without a crazy guy who had this idea of ruling the world by the name of Alexander the Great. So there you go. That's your lesson, and that's it for the chapter. And if you have any questions, please let me know, and thanks for watching.